Okay, so this chapter is a relatively, I think will be an incredibly easy chapter for everyone in this class, because essentially what it does is just reviews what you would have done in your principles course across 2 or 3 chapters when we looked at supply, demand, and equilibrium and government involvement in that market. So with that said, I'm going to go over this chapter very quickly, much faster than I would any of these other chapters which are new material to you. If you need more detail than what I'm covering here, it's very easy for you to send me an email, and I will send you the videos that I have for the principles classes where I do each of these across 2 or 3 chapters. No shame in asking for me to send you those videos. I really, or if you want to remain anonymous, you can simply use my YouTube channel and search for the video as well. If you want to look at the video but don't want to admit you're looking at the chapter, that's absolutely fine. Okay, so with that said, essentially what we're doing here then is looking at demand, supply, how those interact to get to the equilibrium, what happens when we have government involvement in that market, and then what happens to the equilibrium, how it changes when there's a change in the demand or the supply curve, and or both. And one of the first things that we do when we look at demand, obviously, is we talk about how it's a downward sloping curve. That the downward slopingness of the curve comes from the law of demand, which again just tells us that the inverse relationship between the price and the quantity demanded. That's our law of demand, right? Is that we see this inverse relationship between the two, and that what demand tells us is it tells us that 2 conditions are present, which is a willingness and ability of the consumer to purchase that product at any particular price. Willing and able, right? We can talk about things. Why don't I have a speedboat, right? I'm certainly willing to have a speedboat, right? It would be very nice to be able to travel between the islands, but I don't have the money for it. I'm not able to do that. We could talk about other things that I'm able to do, but I'm not willing to do, right? Like, I am able to buy a unicycle, right? I don't know how much unicycles cost, but half the price of a bike, right? There's only one wheel. But I just think it's weird and creepy for grown men to be riding unicycles. So I'm not willing to do that, right? We can think of lots of different goods where one condition is fulfilled and not the other. There's some where neither condition is fulfilled, right? A Tesla car. I neither have the ability to buy such a car, nor am I willing to buy such a fancy car, right? And we can talk about things where both conditions are fulfilled. I bought a Slurpee this morning, right? Both the ability was present and the willingness was present. I know, exciting, big spender, huh? There we go. There's our demand curve. Inverse relationship between price and quantity. And then what we need to talk about is that there's a difference between a movement along the curve versus a shift of the curve. This right here is the slide that's kind of referring to the movement along the curve. That would mean that I'm essentially saying that I'm, for instance, moving from point A to point B along the demand curve. The way that I get a movement from A to B is by changing the price. Changing the price leads to the change in the quantity demanded. This movement comes from the law of demand. The law of demand gives us the movement between these 2 points. Changing the price changes the quantity demanded. You'll notice here that I'm writing quantity demanded as Q subscript D. That's how I'll write that in this course. Otherwise, I'll be talking about demand, and if I shift the demand curve, I'll just talk about it as a change in demand. But here we have a change in the quantity demanded. A movement along the curve. Now, what about the shift? Right? I could get the shift of the curve, which would look something like this. So here I'm saying this is an increase in demand. Here I'm talking about an increase in quantity demanded. Caused by different things. This is caused by a change in the price. This is caused by a change in something other than the price. And that's what you see right here. Changing a factor other than the price leads to this. Changing only the price causes the movement along the curve. And that's what we see in this slide right here, right? That I'm getting the movement along the curve caused by the change in the price. Changing the demand is from changing something other than price. What is those things that are other than price that can change? Here's our list of factors. So we're saying here then that my desire to purchase something is dependent on several factors. That demand is a function of the price of the product. And let's call this variable number 1, variable number 2, variable number 3, variable number 4, variable number 5, variable number 6. So demand is a function of price, variable number 1, variable number 2, variable number 3, 4, 5, and 6. When I change just this, there's our movement. And within that law of demand, what we're typically saying is that this is employing the ceteris paribus assumption. And what ceteris paribus says is that these things are being held constant. All of these things are not being allowed to change when we're talking about the law of demand. To shift the curve does not mean that we're using the law of demand. To shift the curve means changing one of these variables, which is not part of the law of demand at all. Okay. Let's look at just a few of these. I don't want to go into too much detail here. If you want more of the detail about these specifics, this will be a point where I'm not going to go into all the detail. If you want specifics about how each of these, how they specifically cause the shifts, I would say this would be where you would want to look at the intro video, one of the intro videos. I'll try to also, if when needed, I'll try to fill you in on that kind of review specifically as it comes up. I just don't want to make this too much of a principles class because it's obviously a 300 level class. So we have the one example here of advertising. If there's increased advertising, that would generally lead to consumers having more knowledge about the product, perceiving the value perhaps is higher within the product, and you would get that shift this way. That'd be a shift of the curve. And yes, demand is a function, which I already just talked about. It's a mathematical function that tells us then that mathematical understanding of the links between the various products. And that's our linear demand function. So our linear demand function, again, is demand is a function of price. And as we listed it on the other slide, of the price, variable 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right, a whole bunch of these things here. Again, my apologies for going rather quickly here. I just trying to get this reviewed done rather quickly. This slide is basically saying then that that we should look at what the signs of the coefficients are. That is true. The idea here is that what we know from the law of demand is that there should be the first variable that is the reason why it looks like this is from the law of demand. That there should be the inverse relationship between the price and the quantity. That when the price is going down, that the quantity demanded is going up. And then we can talk about how these other coefficients should be designed based on, for instance, whether they are a substitute good or a complement good, a normal good or an inferior good. And what that does is it changes these variables, the signs of these variables. And the reason why that becomes important is, now going into the actual manager part of this, is that managers then find very useful knowing what their demand function looks like. Because knowing what your demand function looks like tells you the valuable information of, are my competitors, are they producing substitute goods or complement goods? Is my good as perceived by consumers, is it perceived as a normal good or an inferior good? These kinds of things are going to influence my advertising campaigns. These are going to influence how I communicate with customers, how I run promotions, and what that linear demand function can do. And what that linear demand function can do is immediately tell me those things. Now, what we can do as well is create something that's known as an inverse demand function. Now, I know in my principles class I don't typically deal with this, so let me just give you an example of how this looks. Inverse demand functions are exactly the same as the market demand function, except what we do is we change what is the dependent variable and the independent variable. So for instance, the way we have typically looked at this is that quantity equals, let's look at something like this. Right, that would be a typical, very simple linear demand function. Negative because we have a inverse relationship between my quantity and the price. All that we're saying for the inverse side of this is that now I'll have 6p equals 15 minus q, p equaling now so all I did is I algebraically switched the p and the q and then divided by 6 to get p equals 2.5 minus 0.166q. So there's my inverse, there's my linear. If you were to graph them out in a graphing calculator, for instance, they would look exactly the same. But you can see how it's useful because now here I'm solving for the quantity, here I'm solving for the price. And so that tells me slightly different information that, again, depending on what I'm interested in, can tell me something a little bit different that's just as useful. And there we go. Looks exactly the same. Should be no different. Now, we've looked at it already. You would have looked at it in your principles class, but now let's actually talk about what the usefulness is of consumer surplus. So the idea with consumer surplus is that, let's say that we have our supply curve, we have our demand curve, and that here is our equilibrium price. That there's then a difference in what consumers were willing to pay versus what they actually paid. That is my consumer surplus. The difference in how they valued it versus what they paid. They were willing to pay this high price, they only paid this price, etc., etc. Now, why is that useful if we're talking about this from a manager's perspective? Because now it allows me as a firm to try to get it in some way. All right, either by finding out who those really highly valued customers are so that I can charge those customers more. That would be the way that I do price discrimination. Or that I find some consumers who aren't willing to pay as much and find some way to get them perhaps to pay that little bit more. And that's what we see right here, right? There's then that difference. I mean, the part to this I could add is the reason why this square comes up is because this is what the consumers are actually paying. Consumers would have been willing to pay this entire, right, the triangle and the rectangle. Instead, all they paid was the rectangle. So then what the firm is trying to do is find some way to get this triangle. And that's why they'll use price discrimination. So the goal of the firm is to find some way to capture that triangle. Capture that consumer surplus in some way. Because that would allow them then to get more revenue. So we then have the supply curve. The supply curve also has a law of supply. If we look at our same market here, we have price and quantity with an upward sloping supply curve. That we also have a law of supply, which talks about now the direct relationship, where they move in the same direction, direct relationship between price and quantity. Ceteris paribus. That's what this essentially tells us, is that ceteris paribus, this is true. So we then have our difference for what exists for movements versus shifts. Again, our movements are caused only by changes in the price. Our shifts is caused by changing something other than the price. And, well, we can see that right here, right? Here would be how I show my decrease in supply. Here would be how I show my increase in supply. And then we can have our movement along the curve. What are those variables that we could do? Variable 1, variable 2, variable 3, 4, 5, and 6, which again gives us this way then of thinking is that demand, or sorry, not demand, that supply is a function of the price and those variables. Where here I'm able to describe the movement along the curve with our law of supply, and that these variables cause our shift 1 through 6. Not using the law of supply because we're not employing the ceteris paribus assumption. Again, with the law of supply, we're holding variables 1 through 6 constant. With the shift, there is no ceteris paribus assumption because that's the whole point. We want the curve to shift. And we can see this in action here in a little way here. One thing that obviously affects supply would be, what if I impose the tax legally on sellers? Well, now sellers are going to have to collect a 20-cent tax, or at least pay a 20-cent tax to the government. They're going to pay it, and consumers are going to pay for it as well. This is a per unit tax. That means each unit is 20 cents more. This is what's called a ad valorem tax. An ad valorem tax is like a percentage tax, so like a sales tax, that kind of thing. Our supply is obviously a function, and in that function, what we see here is, well, just kind of what I said here before, is that supply is a function of price. Sorry, I should be more formal here. Supply is a function of price and variables 1 through 6. And obviously we graph it out. And we often graph it out in a linear fashion because it's simple, it's useful. It's not entirely realistic. Again, we usually draw it as a straight line, but there's nothing more beyond that. The function itself, the coefficients, tell us something useful, especially for managers. This one's not useful, right? Our first variable here, because that's just a reflection of the law of supply. You're noticing here again, the arrows are moving in the same direction. But what is useful is knowing something about how technology plays a role, how inputs play a role, how that would affect my supply curve. And then we obviously know that if we start to give, if we have that linear function and I start to give you numbers, you can then just substitute those numbers into the equation to solve for it. And you would have done that if you'd taken this class, the principles class with me, we would have done this in the appendix to Chapter 3. And we can also set up the function as a inverse function, where the inverse function again is, let's just set this up simple. There's my direct function. My inverse function, I shouldn't say supply here, I should say we have quantity here. There's my inverse, there's my direct. Again, all I'm doing here to get the inverse is algebraically switching them, the P's and the Q's. We also have a producer surplus. That producer surplus, well, let's look at the next slide. I can see it through here. Tells us that there's a difference between the price that's received versus the minimum price they would have been willing to accept. The thing that I say quite often in principles, and I'll repeat it here, is that producer surplus is different than profit. I'll repeat that again. Producer surplus is different than profit. The firm did receive $400. They were willing to accept something much less. What does that mean? That doesn't mean that this is then the profit, because what we're saying here is that the minimum price you were willing to accept doesn't necessarily reflect the full cost of producing that product. They might have been willing to accept the price that did not incorporate the fixed costs. And so there would be a big part of the difference. Producer surplus can be the same as profit. Oftentimes it would not be. Most often, more often than not, they would be different. Where the producer surplus, generally speaking, would be greater than the profit. We can obviously put this all together and get an equilibrium. And what we see in these scenarios here is that what if the price was something other than what it should be? Right? Like, what if the price were, for some reason, up here? If the price were up here, there would be a surplus. There would be a surplus because at that price, the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded. And what that means is that there's then, because of that surplus, there is downward pressure on the price. That's how firms deal with surpluses. They lower the price. And as the price goes down, there's my law of demand. And as the price goes down, there's my law of supply. I move along the curves to the equilibrium. At P double prime, let's put that down here, there's a shortage. The quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied. That generally places upward pressure on the prices. Which, as the price goes up, there's my law of supply. And as the price goes up, there's my law of demand. We see this gravitation then to that equilibrium point, because at the equilibrium, quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied. And as it says right here, that would be our situation where there is no shortage or surplus. And you see that right here in a much nicer looking way. And we can obviously solve for it. We could solve for it in a way where you have the two functions, you set them equal to each other, find the price, then substitute that to find the quantity. I'm not going to go into that, but this would again be the appendix to the chapters. But just out of the necessity of time, and I'm hoping that a lot of you remember this from your principles class. That in general we're setting demand equal to supply. You're solving for the price. And then you're solving for quantity by substituting that price into the functions. That's our general steps. Now, there are times, this is now where we transition to, if you've taken principles with me, this is now where it transitions to the next chapter, chapter 4. But I think also if you've taken it with Dr. Yu, I think in her textbook it also does relatively the same thing. Sometimes the government doesn't want the price, wants the price to be something specific. And then in those cases, they impose either a price ceiling or a price floor. They make the price be something different. The idea here is that I think a good way of understanding these is that there's a difference between an ineffective and an effective price control. The idea is that I can put them anywhere I want, but they're only meaningful in one place. Let's look at it from, I'm not sure if, okay, this is slides 34 through 37. I'm going to do a slight deviation of these 4 slides. I'm going to write some stuff on paper. If you understand what I'm saying, you're perfectly fine skipping over these 4 slides. I didn't particularly like how the author did this part. They're not wrong, I just think there's a better way of explaining it. And who knows, maybe I'm wrong and I'm delusional. So let me just do a short description of that part. So the idea here with again, I like to use, if you had me for principles, I'm repeating myself here, I'm well aware of that. I like to use gasoline as the example because that's something where we pretty much all of us know the price of gasoline. I don't know, I go to Costco, I paid $2.19 a gallon yesterday. Okay, so price ceiling, to review, there would be a law stating the maximum price. Now I can place the price ceiling anywhere I want, but again I said there's a difference between an effective and an ineffective price ceiling. I'm going to start out where it's effective because that's what I want you to remember. Would be if I place it right here. Because now this law would say the price can go no higher than $1. That would be absolutely fine. You probably wouldn't get any objections to that. On the objections to it in terms of like this law makes no sense. Right? This law does have an impact because now Costco is only going to be able to charge me $1 a gallon because it's against the law to do anything otherwise. What we see that this price ceiling does is it creates a shortage in this market. And what the shortage then leads to generally the creation of black markets, illegal markets. Now, what if I placed it, I'm going to use a different color here. What if I had placed it up here? This is going to be an ineffective or meaningless price ceiling. So this would be basically saying the price can go no higher than $5 a gallon. Who cares, right? I mean, it is less than that, so it's not going to really make a difference. This would be a meaningless price ceiling. This would be a meaningful or impactful price ceiling. I just want to make sure I'm covering all the particular elements of what they're doing here. Yeah. Again, using gasoline as an example here. Let's talk about it as a price floor. This would be an effective price floor. This is a law that states the minimum price. And the government could say, hey, the price has to be at least $5. Notice the difference between this, ceilings, again, are laws that say at most or no more than. And then they say the price. Price floors are laws that talk about at least, right? And I don't actually know another way to say it. Basically, at least as much. It would be meaningless if it were down here. This would be an ineffective price ceiling. Because you'd be saying you have to charge at least $1 for a gallon of gas. Costco would be like, we're fulfilling that law, charging $2.19. Okay. I'm going to pause the video here for one moment. Actually, you know what? I'll break this into 2 videos because this is a long chapter. I still have about 20 slides. So I'm going to actually make this into a part 1, part 2 video because of the number of slides here.